You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hilton brings you new ways to stay, with experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at Graduate Hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 492 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, in the last episode, because of the collapse of his peripheral strategy in the spring of 1864, which would allow Confederate reinforcements to be sent to Robert E. Lee from other parts of Virginia, Ulysses S. Grant realized there was no use staying at Spotsylvania any longer, so he decided to swing around Lee's right flank again, and as part of that, he tried to set a trap for Lee by using Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps, but that didn't work, and instead, Lee just fell straight back to the North Anna River, which is about halfway between Spotsylvania and Richmond.
We said that Lee didn't expect a battle there along the North Anna River since he thought Grant would continue sliding the Army of the Potomac to the southeast because Lee assumed that Richmond was Grant's target. However, Lee was wrong because in reality, Richmond itself wasn't Grant's target. Grant's real goal was the destruction of the Army of Northern Virginia.
Robert E. Lee misread Grant's intentions despite the fact that Lee's own goal was the destruction of the Army of the Potomac. Well, in any event, as he contemplated the situation from his new headquarters at Hanover Junction, Robert E. Lee believed his chances of striking a crushing blow against the Yankees were getting better. Because by all accounts, Grant's army was much depleted by its heavy losses in the Wilderness and at Spotsylvania, and was losing thousands of veterans whose enlistments had expired. In addition, Grant's line of communication and supply was becoming longer with every mile south he advanced.
The Army of Northern Virginia's situation was just the reverse. It had lost fewer men, its supply line back to Richmond had grown shorter and was less vulnerable, and as it reached Hanover Junction, it had been reinforced by over 10,000 soldiers from the Shenandoah Valley and Bermuda Hundred.
Even better, only 40 miles now separated Lee's army and Beauregard's forces, and with two railroads linking Hanover Junction and Richmond, a concentration of all available Confederate forces in the region could quickly be made. And on May 23rd, Lee wrote to Jefferson Davis advocating for just such a concentration, saying, "It seems to me our best policy is to unite upon Grant's army and endeavor to crush it. I should be very glad to have the aid of General Beauregard in such a blow, and if it is possible to combine, I think it will succeed."
Obviously, Robert E. Lee believed that by combining Beauregard's force with his own army, the Confederates had a real chance to destroy the Army of the Potomac. And since Lee thought the Army of the Potomac was battered and depleted, he didn't expect Grant to resume the offensive until the Federals had rested and reinforced their army.
However, not surprisingly, Ulysses S. Grant viewed the situation differently. Far from being afraid that Lee would take the offensive, Grant actually hoped his counterpart would do just that. since Grant believed his best chance to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia was to battle it out in the open field, away from earthworks and entrenchments. Nevertheless, Grant knew that Lee had received substantial reinforcements from the Shenandoah Valley and Bermuda Hundred. Benjamin Butler's failure in allowing himself to be bottled up at Bermuda Hundred was especially galling to Grant. On May 22nd, Grant complained to Henry Halleck, quote, "The force under Butler is not detaining 10,000 men in Richmond and is not even keeping the roads south of the city cut."
Under the circumstances, Grant thought it best to give up on the Bermuda Hundred operation. The Federals would retain a toehold at City Point at the confluence of the James and Appomattox rivers, but bring the rest of Butler's Army of the James north to link up with the Army of the Potomac. In addition, Grant wanted Baldy Smith to exercise command of the Army of the James in the field, while Butler rode a desk and took care of administrative duties as department commander.
Contrary to Lee's expectations then, Grant had no intention of suspending offensive operations. Instead, he instructed Meade to have the Army of the Potomac march down to the North Anna crossings. The Federals got on the road early the next morning, May 23rd, but their maps of the region proved woefully inadequate. As a result, 2nd Corps and 5th Corps got tangled up with each other while en route to destinations that turned out to be incorrectly located or non-existent. It took several hours of delay and countermarching to sort things out. Still, by early afternoon on the 23rd, 2nd Corps was approaching Chesterfield Bridge, by which the main Richmond Highway crossed the North Anna, while 5th Corps had reached Jericho Mill, directly on the river about 5 miles upstream.
At Jericho Mill, the North Anna was waist deep and about 50 yards across, an easy wade for infantry, but nearly impassable for wagons or artillery because of steep banks on either side.
Engineers went to work building a pontoon bridge. Meanwhile, 5th Corps Commander Gouverneur K. Warren threw a steady stream of regiments across by way of the ford. By mid-afternoon on the 23rd, he had 2 full divisions on the south bank, and a third was preparing to cross.
Rebel cavalry kept a close watch on the operation, and around 3 p.m., a lone South Carolina infantry regiment sparred briefly with the Yankee picket line. A Confederate prisoner, taken to Warren for questioning, assured him that an entire division, led by Cadmus Wilcox from A.P. Hill's Corps, was not 2 miles distant, arrayed in a defensive position on the other side of the Virginia Central Railroad.
Well, the rebel POW proved accurate enough about the presence of the division, but wrong about its intentions, because around 5:45 that evening, it suddenly materialized and launched a fierce attack. 2 Federal brigades abandoned their positions and ran for the rear. For half an hour or so, the Confederates held the upper hand, but gradually the Yankee resistance stiffened, bolstered by a dozen artillery pieces that dashed across the just-completed pontoon bridge.
The artillery commander, Colonel Charles Wainwright, ordered the cannon to hold on at all cost, and they did. The Federal cannon fire held the rebels at bay until Union infantry were able to stabilize the situation. Fighting continued until nightfall, after which Cadmus Wilcox withdrew his force to nearby Knowles Station.
The fighting at Jericho Mill between Warren's 5th Corps and Wilcox's division cost the Confederates about 730 killed, wounded, and missing, while the Federals lost 377 men. Not long after the fighting started at Jericho Mill, a second engagement opened downstream at Chesterfield Bridge. There, as Hancock's 2nd Corps neared the crossing, the Federals discovered an earthen redoubt on the north bank manned by 3 rebel regiments.
Hancock ordered up 20 cannon to bombard the Confederate position, and deployed 3 infantry brigades to capture it. At 6 p.m., the Federals charged and overran the redoubt, forcing the rebel defenders to flee and literally swim for their lives across the North Anna.
Although Hancock didn't throw any of his troops across the North Anna that evening, the northern bank overlooked the southern bank so handily that the Confederates could never defend it, so Hancock knew that in the morning he could cross the river easily enough.
As the sun set and darkness fell on the evening of May 23rd, the Federals could feel well satisfied with their day's work. They had gained 1 foothold across the North Anna at Jericho Mill and would shortly secure another at Chesterfield Bridge. That meant that if Lee chose to remain in place and stand and fight, he would now do so at a disadvantage.
On the other hand, if Lee withdrew, as Grant had every reason to suppose he would do now that the North Anna line was compromised, well, the Federals might well be able to inflict serious damage on him as he pulled back. Either way, in Grant's eyes, things looked promising.
Across the lines, the Confederates viewed the loss of Chesterfield Bridge as perhaps unavoidable, but the attack at Jericho Mill, though capably made, seemed an expensive mistake. Robert E. Lee was furious that A.P. Hill, in green-lighting the attack, had sent only 1 division.
Confronting Little Powell the next morning, Lee angrily demanded to know why Hill hadn't thrown his whole force against the Federal bridgehead and driven the Yankees back across the river. In Hill's defense, he had apparently based his decision on cavalry reports that only 2 Union brigades had crossed the North Anna at Jericho Mill. Wilcox's division might well have clobbered such a force, but against an entire enemy corps, a Confederate victory was out of the question. In lamenting the failure of the Confederate attack, an officer in a South Carolina regiment admitted the rebel cavalry scouts, quote, had been miserably deceived.
That evening, Robert E. Lee summoned his chief engineer and his senior lieutenants to his headquarters. Together, they reviewed the situation after the day's events.
With the Federals across the North Anna at Jericho Mill, and practically so at Chesterfield Bridge, holding the river line was obviously impossible. The Army of Northern Virginia could retreat, of course, but that would mean abandoning Hanover Junction to the enemy, something that Lee was reluctant to do since the Virginia Central Railroad was his direct link to the Shenandoah Valley.
But gradually, after studying the map and discussing the local lay of the land in detail, an ingenious solution emerged. And so, when the meeting broke up, the engineers and commanders headed off to construct one of the most brilliant defensive positions of the entire war.
What does every USAA member have in common? Family. We're one big family who supports the military community and their eligible families. And if you, your parent, or spouse served, you could join our family and save big on auto insurance. Visit USAA.com/join today to check your eligibility. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
This episode is brought to you by Heyday. Feeling stressed? Take a moment for yourself with Heyday. Stroll through rows of golden wheat, tend to cute barnyard animals, and discover the joys of a digital farm retreat. You don't have to hop in a car or catch a plane. Escape to the farm at the tap of a finger. With Heyday, you're not just tending to a farm, you're tending to yourself. Heyday. Search Heyday, that's Hay space DAY, in your favorite app store. Heyday is a free-to-play mobile game and offers optional in-app purchases and random rewards.
Federal orders for May 24th called for a general advance. 2nd Corps would make its crossing of the North Anna at Chesterfield Bridge, while 5th Corps would push forward from its bridgehead at Jericho Mill, supported by Wright's 6th Corps, which had come up during the night. Meanwhile, Burnside's 9th Corps would cross the river at Ox Ford, about midway between Jericho Mill and Chesterfield Bridge.
The early stages of the operation went off without a hitch, since the Confederates, aside from some scattered musket and cannon fire, made no attempt at resistance. 2 escaped slaves who had made their way across the river during the night were taken to Meade for questioning. He reported to Grant, quote, "I have seen the Negroes and think from what they say the enemy has fallen back beyond the South Anna."
That news tallied with other reports, and at 8 a.m., Grant wrote Halleck, quote, "The enemy have fallen back from the North Anna. We are in pursuit. Negroes who have come in state that Lee is falling back to Richmond." End quote. And as the morning wore on, Warren and Wright overran the Virginia Central Railroad at Knowles Station. They encountered no one except 200 sleeping Confederates inadvertently left behind when Wilcox's division had withdrawn under cover of darkness.
Meanwhile, Hancock got across the river at Chesterfield Bridge and assembled his corps on the south bank. The only opposition he encountered was some half-hearted cannon fire. It certainly looked as if Lee had pulled out.
That morning, the only Federal force that seemed stalled was Ambrose Burnside's Ninth Corps. Burnside had reached Ox Ford as ordered, only to find that it was one of the few places on the river where the south bank was higher than and overlooked the north bank. Burnside also discovered that the rebels seemed to be holding the south bank in force. He sent a message to Grant reporting, "The prospects of success are not at all flattering, but I think the attempt can be made without very disastrous results, and we may possibly succeed."
Such waffling sounded just like Burnside, but still, when noon came and went with Ninth Corps still standing idle, Grant decided to prod him into action. He sent a message saying, "You will move your entire corps to the south side of the North Anna this afternoon."
After offering Burnside some suggestions about how to proceed, the message concluded, "You must get over and camp tonight on the south side." But Burnside objected that that was precisely what he'd been trying to do all morning, but the enemy position on the south bank was simply too daunting. However, he said he had discovered another crossing point, Quarles Ford, a mile upstream, and had sent a division there. Once it had crossed there, it would turn east and drive the rebels from Ox Ford.
That was promising, at least, and aside from Burnside's troubles, the overall picture, as viewed from Grant's headquarters, was very positive. Assistant Secretary of War Charles Dana captured Grant's mood in 2 dispatches he sent to Washington that day. The first, written during the early morning, said, quote, "The enemy have fallen back. Whether to take up a position beyond the South Anna or to go to Richmond is uncertain. Reports brought by Negroes favor the latter alternative. Warren, Burnside, and Hancock are pushing forward after the retreating army."
And a follow-up dispatch at 1 p.m. was even rosier. However, in mid-afternoon, the picture changed suddenly when a 5th Corps division, sent to help Burnside, cleared Quarles Ford, but then struck a strong Confederate line of entrenchments on its right front.
And around 3 p.m., 2nd Corps encountered Confederate skirmishers a half-mile north of Hanover Junction. The rebels seemed in no hurry to leave, so John Gibbon sent a regiment forward to dislodge them. When the regiment got nowhere, Gibbon reinforced it, gradually feeding in more troops until most of his division was in action.
The Federals finally drove off the rebel skirmishers and overran a line of entrenchments, only to discover a second, more formidable line farther on. Within minutes, a considerable force of Confederates poured forth from this second line, evidently intent on recovering their just-lost earthworks. Gibbon fought them off, but not without difficulty, and from prisoners taken in this encounter, Hancock received some sobering news. The enemy in his front belonged to Dick Ewell's corps, with at least 1 division from Anderson's corps nearby. That meant, although the situation was unclear, plainly the Army of Northern Virginia hadn't withdrawn to the South Anna or beyond, but was still somewhere around Hanover Junction.
Meanwhile, Major General Thomas Crittenden's 9th Corps Division had crossed the North Anna at Quarles Ford and by 4 p.m. faced the west side of the bluff overlooking Oxford. But a formidable line of Confederate earthworks stood atop the bluff, and the prospect of a successful assault looked as bleak to Crittenden from the south bank as it had from the north.
The prospect of a successful assault looked bleak, that is, to everyone except Brigadier General James Ledlie, who commanded Crittenden's lead brigade. Convinced that he faced only a rebel rear guard, Ledlie unhesitatingly put his 1,500 men in line of battle and rolled forward, to the horror of Crittenden, who wondered if Ledlie knew that the rest of the division was not yet up.
The veteran Confederate troops holding this sector were from Brigadier General William Little Billy Mahone's division, and from the protection of their earthworks, they shattered Ledlie's assault in a matter of minutes.
Dozens of Federal soldiers fell to the rebel musket and cannon fire, and 100 were taken prisoner. Afterward, witnesses claimed Ledlie had been, quote-unquote, thoroughly liquored up, which he quite probably was. However, incredibly, he escaped censure for the debacle at Oxford, and within a few weeks, he replaced Crittenden in command of the division.
By 6:45 that evening, as the survivors of Ledlie's ill-fated assault withdrew to safety, the situation facing the Army of the Potomac was becoming apparent. The Confederate Army was indeed still in the area, and it defended a new line that was, if anything, more formidable than holding the river crossings would have been.
The position resembled an inverted V, with the vertex at Oxford and the shanks running southwest and southeast to cover Hanover Junction. The entire line was heavily entrenched because the rebel troops had thrown up earthworks all night and improved them during the day. As Confederate Brigadier General Evander Law explained it, the result was to place Grant, quote, in what may be called a military dilemma. He had cut his army in two by running it upon the point of a wedge, end quote, with the point of the wedge being at Oxford.
Law continued, observing that Grant, quote, could not break the point, which rested upon the river, and the attempt to force it out of place by striking on its sides must of necessity be made without much concert of action between the two wings of his army, neither of which could reinforce the other, while his opponent could readily transfer his troops, as needed, from one wing to the other across the narrow space between them.
In other words, by creating the inverted V position, Robert E. Lee brilliantly retrieved a situation that had seemed badly compromised by the Federal lodgements at Jericho Mill and Chesterfield Bridge. By constructing, overnight, a new defensive position that allowed him to remain below the North Anna but above the South Anna, Lee could continue to cover Hanover Junction, while at the same time, the nature of the wedge, with its point at Oxford, placed Grant on the horns of a dilemma, since it left the Yankees with no easy way to crack open the Confederate position. And that's where we'll leave things for now. Next time, we'll see how Ulysses S. Grant approached finding a solution to this problem that Robert E. Lee had handed him.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is Echoes of Glory, Illustrated Atlas of the Civil War by the editors of Time Life Books.
This is still our go-to Civil War atlas when people ask us for a recommendation, and we're pulling Echoes of Glory off the bookshelf and dusting it off now, so to speak, because if you're having trouble picturing all of this maneuvering by the armies and the positions they're taking up, it helps a great deal to have a good Civil War atlas at hand. And on page 149 of Echoes of Glory, there's a map that shows the routes the armies used to march away from Spotsylvania and shows the North Anna and South Anna rivers and the line of the Virginia Central Railroad and the location of Hanover Junction.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way.
Just like Alex F. and Devin B. did recently.
A big thank you to them, and also to James D. for his donation.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.